I've recently taken an interest in the philosophy of psychiatry and have begun to study it for a reading class. Although I do not think that it is particularly wise or useful to approach the subject of psychiatry from an anti psychiatry perspective, I do think that it is important to have certain broad questions in mind. Namely, the question of whose interest does psychiatry serve, and one also needs to pay attention to the way in which language is sometimes used to obscure matters within the realm of psychiatry. Now, of course, one should also ask how should psychiatrists behave and how should psychiatry develop. But in this video, what I'm going to do is provide a discussion of the illness of attention deficit disorder from a philosophical perspective, with emphasis on using the ordinary language of inattentiveness versus the psychiatric jargon of attention deficit disorder, to shed some light on the issue and see if what we're really talking about here is an illness or if it's as common as it's made out to be. Now, it is safe to say that the idea of inattention has existed for a long time. The idea conveyed by the expression attention deficit disorder, on the other hand, is a relatively new idea. The expression attention deficit disorder was apparently introduced in the US in the 1980s, and presumably it was not introduced to convey the exact same idea that is conveyed by the word inattention. The expression attention deficit disorder is widely used, and people readily apply it to inattentive children in particular. But what exactly are they doing, and what are the implications if they choose to apply the expression attention deficit disorder instead of using the word inattention? A pair of examples will show us that there is a difference and help to pinpoint the nature of that difference. Compare the following examples. First example. Johnny is frequently inattentive, but that is all right because he already has the information that is being conveyed. The second example. Johnny is suffering from attention deficit disorder, but that is all right because he already has the information that is being conveyed. The first example reminds us, from a common sense and moral point of view, that inattention is not always a problem for anyone. Now, while we might say that Johnny is inattentive, we are not implying that his mind has actually gone blank. Presumably he is almost always attending to something while he is awake. But of course, it would be odd to say that all is well, while simultaneously speaking of Johnny suffering from a disorder, even if he already had the information that he is not paying attention to, and is attending to something that is more worth attending to. We would not want to say that suffering from a disorder is all right. Now, however, we surely should not wish to introduce the notion of suffering from a disorder in the first place if Johnny is simply choosing to use his time wisely, or even if he cannot bring himself to listen to an all too familiar message, just as we cannot bear to pay attention to a wall for many hours. So then there is a difference between the idea of inattention and the idea of attention deficit disorder, and we begin to see what it is. When we describe someone as inattentive, we are leaving open the question of whether there is anything wrong with the person or his or her behavior, whereas the expression attention deficit disorder suggests, in the word disorder, that there is something wrong with the person, and the word deficit is used there to convey that, meaning that the problem lies in a shortage or an absence of attention rather than a diversion of attention to something else. An actual deficit in attention, like having a blank mind while not asleep, would indeed be a disorder by almost anybody's standards. But attention to one thing rather than another is a different kettle of fish. Even if we think that Johnny is behaving in a misguided or irresponsible fashion by being inattentive, we should hesitate to say that he is suffering from a disorder that can be characterized as an attention deficit. Almost certainly he is attending to something else instead, and we do not normally speak of a disorder just because we believe someone to be misguided or irresponsible. Even if Johnny agrees that he should be paying attention and wants to do so but cannot bring himself to, we should hesitate to apply the word disorder, because Johnny's inability to pay attention may be in fact quite healthy. For example, if the material was repugnant or very boring, or if his judgment is that what he should be paying attention to is based on some other considerations, such as the need to pass an examination. Suppose that you are told that you will be punished if you do not pay attention to a blank wall for 3 hours. If you cannot do it, we would not say that you are suffering from a disorder, even if you said that you wish to, and that you wished you could comply with the demand. If Johnny is not paying much attention in school, is that because there is something wrong with him? Is it because he does not recognize the value of what's being taught? Is it because he does not need to pay attention? Is it because he has something more valuable to pay attention to? Is it because he thinks that there are more urgent matters that require his attention, such as dire conditions at his home? Is it because the material being presented is too repugnant? What are the appropriate responses to Johnny's inattention? From a common sense and moral point of view, the answer would vary quite a lot depending on the circumstances. Perhaps we could conclude that there is something wrong with him, but perhaps we should conclude that his inattention is not a problem at all. Perhaps we should discuss the value of what is being taught with him. Perhaps we should agree that he had something more valuable or urgent to pay attention to, or perhaps we should agree that he should not expose himself to repugnant material. Perhaps we should fault the teacher or the entire education system for creating a negative reaction. The old term inattention is neutral, leaving us to choose among a wide range of diagnoses or responses. The much newer expression, attention deficit disorder, is not neutral at all, but promotes the idea that there is something wrong with Johnny, excluding the idea that there is actually nothing wrong at all, or that the problem lies elsewhere. Notice that if we avoid using the expression attention deficit disorder and instead talk of a person's inattention, this does not preclude the option of considering the use of pharmaceuticals to enable a person to pay attention. Suppose that Johnny is not paying attention to his teacher because he is thinking about a grave situation in his home. If the problem in his home can not be overcome very quickly, it might make sense to consider the use of a pharmaceutical. But what needs to be avoided is the idea that there is something wrong with Johnny. Or suppose that Johnny is terribly bored with his lessons. An appropriate solution might lie in persuading Johnny to see the lessons in a new light or changing what is taught. But if these things cannot be done, then it might make sense to help him pass the course with the aid of a pharmaceutical. What we need to avoid, though, is the notion that Johnny's not realizing the importance of the lessons is amounting to a disorder. And we must not confuse a defect in the school with a disorder in Johnny. We need to be open to the possibilities, all of the possibilities that the word inattention leaves open, and avoid the blinding impact of the expression attention deficit disorder. The expression attention deficit disorder plays a similar part to that of the word dyslexia in disguising defects in the social system as defects in individuals, who in many cases are the victims of the social system. Starting after the First World War, when behaviorist psychology was launched, the U.S. launched the processes which are crudely designated as dumbing down, and to protect those processes from criticism and attack the source of the resulting problems that had to be hidden. As Rudolf Flesch showed in his books Why Johnny Can't Read and Why Johnny Still Can't Read, changing from phonics to the whole word method of teaching children to read resulted in a lower rate of literacy, and the cause was disguised by creating the notion of the dyslexic child, which pointed away from the teaching method and to the child as the source of the problem. Similarly, the expression attention deficit disorder suggests a defect in the child which, depending on circumstances, may blind us to problems elsewhere, whether they may be in the child's home, in the teacher, in the curriculum, or somewhere else. Pharmaceuticals tend to have unwelcome side effects, which constitute a ground for rejecting their use, but expressions like attention deficit disorder, sets of words, cause damage of their own. They burden children and others with the belief that they are defective when they are not, and they divert us from solving problems by obscuring the actual nature of the problems. A New York doctor, Lawrence H. Diller, has written expensively about ADHD diagnosis. His article, The Run on Ritalin, published in Medical Ethics Journal called Hastings Center Reports in 1996, covers the ground particularly well. On his website, docdiller.com, he provides the following answer to a student who was diagnosed as suffering from ADD and wonders whether he still has the disorder. Diller replies as follows: I know that these days we are told if you have ADHD, you have it for life, and that you'll have to take Ritalin as well. I don't find in the kids that I see that that's how it's working out. As they get out of high school, they are more able to choose the things they want to do, and so they are more motivated and don't need the medication. However, some want to remain in an academic setting, and even if it's not where their main interests or skills are. They become candidates for medication. So if you're doing well enough, don't worry about ADD. But if you're struggling enough, I suppose you can take the medications again or reconsider whether this is really what you want to be doing right now. Good luck. We see here how the idea of a disorder in the student is blinding him to the need to question the academic choices and or the appropriateness of what is being done in the education system. We may note that if you implant the idea that education is job training and then insist on 12 or more years of schooling for a person whose job will only take a few minutes to learn, then you are asking for trouble. Seeing the causes of the trouble in various types of students' defectiveness reduces pressure for change in the system, which constantly puts students in situations in which they have to do things they have little or no desire to do, but which the system very much wants them to do. We are sometimes told that students who do not or cannot pay attention in school are in a specific state caused by too much sugar or too much television or too much of something else. If that is so, then there is the option of changing one's diet or their viewing habits or etc. But to get these matters into perspective, we must note that there can be very few people who are unable to pay attention to the things that really matter to them. Almost everyone, for example, is capable of attending properly to traffic, for instance, because our lives depend on having that capacity. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the DSM diagnostic criteria of ADHD. The diagnosis of ADD rests on the application of criteria, satisfaction of which amounts only to failure to pay attention to something someone, perhaps including yourself, wants you to pay attention to. In The Run on Ritalin, Diller describes how the diagnostic criteria has evolved in such a way that more and more people satisfy them and more Ritalin is sold. On page 13, he says the following about one of the later formulations in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. One need not demonstrate symptoms in every situation. Rather, one need only display symptoms in at least 2 environments. Similarly, one may concentrate satisfactorily at a number of tasks, perhaps even overfocus, yet still meet the criteria for diagnosis if concentration and focus are problems for important tasks, such as example of selective inattention or attention's inconsistency. Now we have to note the usage of the word important here, because that is a value judgment. Personally, I think that there are important tasks that very few people are concentrating on, and that no one concentrates at all on all important tasks. But I am not inclined to say that everyone suffers from ADD, because that would be grossly misleading. The diagnostic criteria that Diller describes raise one obvious question: who decides what it is that is important to focus on, and what is worth focusing on? The mere fact that Johnny is not focused on material that someone else judges to be important is not sufficient ground for saying that he suffers from a disorder, even from the point of view of someone who agrees that the material is important. If Johnny has something even more important to focus on, then it is healthy that he does so. If he finds the material too repugnant or boring to focus on, we should no more ascribe an attentional deficit to him than we do ourselves when we find material too boring or repugnant to focus on. If he already has the information being conveyed, we should congratulate him on using his mind in a more productive way by attending to something else, and so on. The medical criteria divert us from carefully examining the context in which inattentiveness is occurring, inducing us to leap to the mere fact that things judged important are not being focused on, to the conclusion that there is something wrong with the person involved, i.e., a physiological defect in their brain.